I had read about reckonings in policy memos and seen them once in a clipping Harmon kept in a drawer, a yellowed report about an administrative storm that had washed a county's calendars thin, but nothing prepares you for a reckoning that smells like tuna and warm soup. The basement of forgotten amendments has the acoustic dignity of a vault and the curious intimacy of a confessional. It is where paper goes to be forgiven and where tired signatures learn to sing again. We carried our liturgy in our arms. The table was a plain thing scarred with decades of glue and accidental annotations. Forms lay down like small, obedient animals, emergency requisitions, exemption slips, a narrow column of stamps each labeled with a time nobody wanted back. Harmon turned the key in a lock that thrummed as if it were part of some enormous heart. And for a breath the entire room hummed with an attention I recognized as perilous and holy. Miss Ledger folded her hands over a ledger she carried like a shawl. Owen, mischief tucked in the crease of his smile, arranged the stapler as if preparing a tiny, ceremonial guillotine. Dot hovered nearby, a coffee-stained smudge with a halo and an appetite, chewing on a marginal ellipsis like it was an after-lunch biscuit. The slip, for its part, waited in the corner where the old redaction machines breathed their dust. It was an absence that wore the smartest suit in the room. If you have never addressed a thing that argues like a smudge, you do not know how persuasive suggestion can be. The slip spoke not with a voice so much as with punctuation and crumbs. At first there was only the scent of erased ink and the sensation of a sentence unfinished. Then the air itself seemed to tilt and a fragment of paper flapped against my leg like a nervous bird. It was impossible not to anthropomorphize. The creature had the diplomatic manners of a cat that had once been a clerk. Ms. Ledger called it by name, and even if her jaw tightened, there was the curl of a private smile in her mouth. You saw then why she had survived as a supervisor for so long. She could call a smudge by its name and still keep a cool hand on a stack of forms. You do this with signatures, it said, like a comma tasting like honey. You fuss over a stamp and call comfort by its formal name. But comfort is slow and life in its misprint is sometimes faster. It was not so much a temptation as a plea. The slip could show you the world where schedules were perfect. It could show you a childhood with no surprise homework, a town without untimely rain, a calendar that always met your expectations exactly. For an instant, and not a smaller instant than you might imagine in a basement that smelled like mistakes and coffee, I felt the lulling possibility of a life without disappointment. My chest unclenched, my glasses fogged with an imaginary future where things did not slip. Why would I want to keep the inconveniences the slip offered? Crumbs of erased ink dandruffing from its lapel. You say you are tired. We all are. A world without microagonies is a world where nothing small can surprise you. Is surprise not also a kindness? The rhetorical question was barbarous because it appealed to the private archive of my life, the tiny mismatches that had once stitched me into joy. My mother had kept a crooked photograph of a family picnic, one side of the frame askew, because the imperfection meant the wind had been real. I had filed that photo once as a child, insisting on its straightness, and the result had been something sterile. The memory had toned down. The slip, ink-flecked and elegant in its inelegance, understood that the unfiled edges of our days sometimes contained grace. Do not think this was some grand morality lecture. The slip was practical and, in its way, charming. It did not promise chaos. It proposed curation. It proposed a world where certain errors, small, humane, stubborn errors, were preserved. That is what made its philosophy dangerous. A benevolent anarchy would sound lovely in a policy briefing, too lovely in a ledger. It meant choices. It meant signatures. It meant my name on a form that could determine whether someone remembered a love, a lobster, a rain that understood sorrow. Harmon did not look impressed. He is a man who wears official displeasure like a robe. His voice is the sound a seal makes when it is trying not to bark. He placed the humming vault key on the table like a benediction. "We will negotiate," he he said. Negotiation in the bureau means a set of forms executed with ritual and love. Harmon's love is administrative. It is as tender as a fine handwriting. He slid a slim exemption through to me's ledger. This one, he said, is dangerous but necessary if we are to practice mercy and remain a coherent agency. Me's ledger took the exemption and read it as someone might read a short, private prayer. Her fingers, ink-stained at the tips, trembled just enough for me to know the choice was not easy. She signed as if the pen were a small sword. Owen's role in our theater was to make me laugh when the room threatened to buckle under its seriousness, and to perform the thing, the outward, literal act that our language could only ritualize. He had tucked under his arm an old tie. It was ridiculous and sweet, a tie with a committee's logo long since obsolete, from a speech he had once given on the elasticity of memory. He informed us, in a voice that pretended nonchalance and delivered a small tremor of solemnity, that he would be the stapler. He meant the old tie would be threaded through a chain of pages and physically secured. He meant that by sacrificing the sentimental garment, he would transfer his willingness to keep one inconvenient thing to the ledger itself. Finer points of nostalgia, he said, folding the tie like a flag, as if making an altar, require hard staples. Dot, the file sprite, hovered in an ellipsis and chewed a sliver of marginalia thoughtfully. The creature's eyes were coffee stains, its small hands smeared with glyphs. It had been our bait in the traps that went sideways, our liability when rituals required an appetite. It agreed to be the bait again, more because it had a taste for the slip's particular ink than for any abstract righteousness. I liked Dot nonetheless. It had the uncomfortable moral clarity of beings that live between sentences and thus never grew bored of meaning. The table was a map. Forms were laid in concentric offerings. The exemption granted by Harmon was a keyhole. Me's ledger's signature would be the lock. Owen's tie, when threaded and stapled, would be the hinge. My part, my terrible, small, human part, was to decide which errors would be permitted to remain after the stapling. It felt absurd to make such a choice. It felt necessary. Our bureaucratic language softened into rhetoric because every signature bent the world. Make a list, Me's ledger suggested, with a thin exhale. Lists are neat and cruel, but sometimes they speak honestly. She pushed a pencil to me, and I felt as if a vet were placing a thermometer in the world. I wrote and I scratched. I thought of the mayor and his lobster, of the rain that only fell on sad days, of the misfiled week that had begun an entire romance, of the old bus that played a jukebox song only when you needed it most. I thought of the time my mother had gotten lost on a perfectly planned walk and found an unscheduled neighbor who later became family. I wrote those down. I wrote down small things, the bent corner of a bill where a child had once kept a pressed leaf, the way a clerk once winked at an unhelpful regulation and sealed it with a stamp that smelt of oranges. I felt ridiculous and religious. The slip drifted closer, leaving a wake of erased punctuation. It did not screech or demand. It offered visions like a kindly con artist. It showed me a version of the office where no one ever missed a memo and where Owen's tie remained forever unsacrificed and eternally wrinkled. In that world, I would be less anxious because my days would align to a schedule and my music would never arrive late. It was an appealing vista for a person whose hands trembled when faced with the ledger. I remember thinking, not for the first time in my life, how gentle it might be to never wait for anything. Comfort is boring, Harmon said without heat. Perfection is a policy for machines and for people with hearts made of stamped seals. He looked at me. You will decide what is human. That sentence sat on the air between us like a sapona. We began the ritual. Owen threaded the tie through the pages and spoke as if he were telling a joke he did not want us to laugh at. The stapler's arm came down with a sound like a small apology, a metallic thud that echoed in the basement's wooden ribs. The machine released a tiny cloud of dust. I sneezed. Dot sang an ellipsis so sharp it sounded like a hymn. Ledger impressed a stamp that smelled faintly of brand new envelopes and gilt. Harmon turned the humming key which, when used in the right sequence, made the room's clocks correct themselves in the way a heart finds its beat after running. For a shard of a moment the slip balked. It grew smaller as if someone had rubbed it with a bureaucrat's handkerchief. It offered me one more thing purely, shamelessly seductive. Your childhood returned to a straight line, your worries dissolved into well-ordered columns. There was no pain in the promise, only a smoothness that felt like a blank page. And standing in that basement with the stapler's warmth leaking into my palms, I realized what the slip would cost. It would not just take my anxiety. It would take the odd serendipities that had taught me how to be compassionate in the first place. It would make me efficient at the price of being lovable. It would replace rescues with indexes. I thought of the mayor's lobster and how voters had laughed and then, briefly, found themselves kinder. I thought of my own small mistakes, catalogued in a folder labeled "Maybe," and how they had led me into this room where I learned to put a stamp on mercy. We will not make every day comfortable, I said before I had time to edit myself. My voice sounded like a paper cut. The slip was not crushed. It withdrew a little, leaving freckled smudges along the margin like a map of its faint displeasure. It was the size of a regret now, nothing more apocalyptic than a coffee stain on a report, Mies. Ledger sealed the exemption and slid the stamped forms into Harmon's humming vault. Owen, absurdly somber, folded his battered tie and placed it into the ledger as a witness. The tie was perfumed with an old confidence I had never seen him wear before. We did not win in the way war stories brag, nor did we lose with melodrama. The slip retreated to the margins where it belonged, mollified by concession. In exchange for our restraint, it allowed a curated list of errors to endure. The mayor kept a small lobster who, to every person's astonishment, proved to be excellent at smoothing ceremonial protocol and at consoling eccentric constituents. A rain that fell for sad days was allowed to stay because it had, in a few instances, prompted strangers to share umbrellas and words. An old bus retained its jukebox song, because it had once returned to a boy the only thing he had ever lost, a song he needed to remember his father. Harmon closed the vault with the same care you use when you tuck someone you love into bed. Mies. Ledger sighed as if someone had untied a tight knot in her chest. Owen's hands were ink-smudged and sticky where the stapler had caught the tie, and he made a small, genuine grin that suggested he had learned something about permanence. Dot tucked itself into a new marginal note and wrote an ellipsis that, on inspection, read like a promise. I felt changed in the way that file folders feel when they have been handled enough, edges softened, corners kissed by use. I had made a choice, small and bureaucratic, and it had weight. The world that emerged from the basement of forgotten amendments was not perfectly orderly, nor was it wholly given over to the slip's mischief. It was negotiated messy in a way that felt alive. On the ride up with Sally, who pressed the elevator buttons with the deliberation of a woman who knew which days were safe and which were homework. The lamps in the cab buzzed like the last chorus of an anxious choir. We rose through floors smelling of different mistakes and memories. When the doors opened, sunlight had tilted in and the building's clocks struck the hour with a new, yet familiar chorus. Somewhere in the city a mayor waved at a lobster and someone else's misfiled week returned, bearing an extra afternoon in which two people met in a bakery and made a small, brave pact. There was paperwork to complete, inevitably. The Bureau is not a place that believes in eternal applause. It believes in forms. We filed the signatures, sealed the exemptions, and labeled the list of preserved errors with a neat hand that made the world less precarious and more human. Mies. Ledger placed a post-it on the ledger, where my name read like a new entry, Finch. August chose mercy, where neatness demanded dominance. She didn't say it aloud, but the crease of her worry softened as if someone had ironed a stubborn wrinkle. We left the basement of forgotten amendments with our pockets full of small concessions and a new inventory of the world. I carried a list of errors to keep, a ledger lighter for the absence of Owen's tie, and the knowledge that sometimes a policy requires the exact courage to be imperfect. The slip remained in the margins, patient, perhaps a little pleased. It had not been vanquished. It had been negotiated with. That is the thing bureaucracy rarely admits. Signatures can be kindness. Stamps can be mercy. And in the end, you cannot staple a heart into a ledger, but you can sign that you tried. As we filed the last forms and Harmon returned the key to its drawer, the office exhaled as if released from a held breath. Mabel's soup in the cafeteria tasted, that afternoon, like safe harbor and misadventure all at once. I do not know whether the slip will return. Creatures made from margins have ways of rustling when least expected. I do know this, when it comes, I will feel the tug of perfect order again. That tug will be soft, like the promise of no more anxious mornings. But I will remember the mayor's lobster and the boy's lost song, and I will remember that hands folded over ledgers can, sometimes, choose to be kind even when the neat thing is easier. We had performed our stapling, our signatures, our small rebellion. We had argued with a smudge about the ethics of surprise, and come away with a world a little less obedient and a little more forgiving. The slip had learned how to negotiate. I had learned how to sign for mercy. The lights in the basement clicked back into indifferent hums, and the great vault sang like an engine that had been oiled with intention. As I went back to my desk, the binder labeled maybe clutched to my chest like an infant. I opened it and found that someone had slipped in a new marginal note in a handwriting I nearly recognized, an ellipsis from Dot, and, beneath it, a tiny stamped lobster. I smiled, which is a dangerous thing in a place that measures facial expressions for compliance. There was ink on my fingers and toner under my nails, and a ledger-shaped dent in my heart that I suspected I would keep for a very long time. The slip had been confronted. The world had been stapled back into something resembling sequence. And lunchtime, as ever, arrived with its ordinary miracles, soup, laughter, and the knowledge that not everything that goes wrong should be righted. The building smelled, as it always did, of toner and distant thunder. I sat down and, for the first time that morning, I ate my sandwich without worrying whether it remembered being someone else. The memory of the basement stayed with me like an unfiled note, a margin that I could look back to when the neatness of life seemed overwhelming. Somewhere in the ledger, our signatures glimmered like a small constellation of agreed imperfections. We had chosen mercy, and the world had accepted a few of its own beautiful errors. The slip, mollified, slipped away. For now. And then the lights flickered, which may mean something or nothing at all. I folded my hands and wrote a new sticky note, which I stuck into maybe, keep the lobster, keep the rain, keep the lost song. Keep the imperfect map of us. Keep an eye on the margins. Keep a stapler ready. The noon decision had been made, but the work of living with it had only just begun. The hook sinks in then. What else will the margins whisper next? I will tell you how noon sounds at the Bureau. It is not merely a chiming of clocks. Noon at the Bureau of Impossible Coincidences is a chorus, each clock humming its own nervous frequency. The fluorescent lights catching toner in the air like dust in sunlight, and the building itself intoning something you might call a prayer if your parish used stamps. There was a staccato of footsteps and a low, steady whir when we assembled in the basement of amendments. It smells there like old promises and wet paper. Harmon's key thrummed on the table like a cheap throat after singing, as if it weren't simply metal, but the larynx of the place. Mies. Ledger arranged witness stamps into an arch with her hands, which is to say she folded them both literally and ceremonially, as if a stamp could be coaxed into behaving like a blessing. I had on my too large blazer, of course. It felt, at that moment, less like clothing than armor assembled from the wrong department. My glasses kept fogging with the weight of the choice. Owen kept making small, inappropriate jokes about the ritual, staple for the people, he said at one point, and that made Dot giggle in the margin, which sounded like a page catching on a nail. Mabel had sent us soup that tasted of thyme and certain hard truths. Amy had finished fussing over a stack of emergency requisitions until their edges gleamed. Miss R. Pockets had brought an orphan object, as promised, an umbrella handle sculpted into the shape of a small, patient elephant. He laid it on the table with a ceremony that made the elephant look like an honored guest. We had rehearsed the list, as if lists could be rehearsed like plays. Harmon would sign the exemption. Mies Ledger would affix her witness crease. Owen would perform the sacrificial stapling, and I, August Finch, pitcher of apologies to stationery everywhere, would select the curated errors to retain. I do not have the word choose in my childhood vocabulary without a dozen post-it notes. My mother catalogued our family like a librarian who mistrusted chaos. Birthdays in rigid, penciled-in boxes, vacations scheduled at a distance. A cupboard that held labeled jars for condiments and feelings. I grew up to believe order was honor, that a day belonged in its slot for the same reasons a plate belonged in the sink. So the slips off a silken, insinuating, like a redaction-given voice was not merely a prompt. It was a temptation the heart had been trained to desire. It spoke first as a smudge of ink at the edge of the ledger, a darkness that could have been spilled tea. Then, with a tilt, it unfurled language. You could have it, it said. I know, because Mies Ledger recorded the exact phrasing later. No rain on birthdays, no missed buses. The whole of childhood lined up like a parade. You wouldn't wake to wrong days. You would wake to the right ones. The ledger need never wrinkle again. Its voice was like a stack of letters being bent back into order. And with each syllable the clocks seemed to pretend to be clocks, and the humming key held its breath. Owen's hand, meanwhile, hovered unconcernedly near a box of industrial staples as if he had been born attached to the thing. He pulled his tie aside because, theatrically, the tie was going to be the object of sacrifice. It had once sported a constellation pattern. He had been fond of it when the stars were smaller jokes and his responsibilities were nothing heavier than a misfiled memo. He smiled at me, the kind of smile that could be both absurd and unaccountably brave. If anyone asks, he said, tell them I'm stapling my dignity. If anyone asks me, Ledger replied before I could make a joke I didn't trust, tell them I am witnessing something proper. Also, perhaps, another cup of tea after. Her voice had that dry thing it uses. It was the same voice that once rewired a regulation with a postage stamp. The slip was not sloppy about seduction. It set out scenes, my life without the week that had slid, a childhood where schedules were never wrong. The town's weather that became a faithful servant, never raining on anyone's parade unless it served a municipal function. It made the office clock's chime sound like choir practice for the perfect. In doing so, it brought the thing my mother had taught me, tiredness, into the light like an offering. The temptation felt like relief, but the slip also had the gall of a poet. It could recite the small ways in which the accidental had saved people, a rain that fell only on sad days and coaxed umbrellas out like sheltering flowers. A mayor who, in his lobster hat incarnation, found a way to apologize for a development plan with a pinch and a flourish that somehow calmed protesters. It reminded us with impeccable manners that not every wrong was cruel. Why not keep everything? Harmon asked the smudge, though his tone did not carry accusation. It carried history. Harmon had seen ledgered ages and blank spaces, and his eyes, magnified by lenses like stamped seals, had the tiredness of someone who had watched too many pages burn and had tried to put out the fire with a pencil. The slip considered him in a way that looked like a margin looking up from its own work. Because life would be neat, it said. And neatness, like a closed book, stops breath. A calendar without surprise is a calendar that forgets to feel. It left crumbs of erased ink that curled like cigarette smoke in a noir film that never existed. There was, at that moment, a small temptation to resign, to nod, to sign, and to march back upstairs into the city, where children would have birthdays that never dripped, where buses would arrive on time on the stresses of a well-placed stamp. The thought was a balm. It brushed through me like the correct application of a form that fixed a splintered knuckle in the ledger of things. And then I looked at Owen as he unfolded his tie. I thought of the file he had kept secret in the basement, small, fragrant with nostalgia and poor choices and inconvenient coincidence, had been hoarding like contraband. I had seen, in the basement, the way he touched that file as if it were a living thing, as if it had been a person who once loved an alternative. I thought of Mee's ledger and the weather festival she had once saved by filing a single postcard into Anne. When the last stapled edge of the ledger clicked into place and Harmon folded his enormous hands as if they were a competent seal on a very anxious bird, the building exhaled. It was not a theatrical exhale. No choir of clerks released a long, operatic sigh, but 100 small things happening at once, a kettle's hum tapering off, a stack of forms sliding into neatness with a soft pap, someone in the mailroom whistling a bureaucratic jingle they had hummed as a child and never mentioned. I stood for the first time since dawn, without the urgent burn of panic in the back of my throat. Relief arrived like an overdue stamp marked paid. We had done the job the only way the Bureau ever does, in paperwork and in ritual. There had been signatures that smelled faintly of coal and promises, a stapling so literal it bent the spine of an old tie into a hinge, and a marginal note from Dot that read, in 3 fat ellipses, "If the world must be tidy, let it be tidy with pockets." The slip had been coaxed back to the margins, the crumbs of erased ink tucked under strict folds, and the mayor's lobster, to the public's extraordinary delight, was now legally recognized as a municipal pet of diplomatic value. This latter clause alone would have made a good pair of op-eds, if the world had had space for op-eds that day. The restoration was not perfect. It was not supposed to be. The team had decided, in a desperate meeting whose minutes I later read and which made Mee's ledger's careful handwriting look as though it had done yoga, that a few honest mistakes could remain. The small lobster, the rain that only fell when umbrellas were forgotten by people who deserved a good cry, and a Tuesday afternoon replay of a child's afternoon at a park bench that made a particular retired postman laugh so hard he cried. These were not accidents worth erasing. They were misfiles that had become mercies. We voted somewhat informally, with postage and a crescent of empathy, and approved a curated list. The bureaucracy is a tool, Harmon said that morning, his spectacles catching the late light. A tool is dull if used without care. We will sharpen by hand. He tapped the humming key at his belt, and it made a sound like a heartbeat inside a vault. That sound has always made me think of responsibility, which is not the same as punishment. Responsibility smells of toner that is a little too warm and tastes faintly like overbrewed tea. People moved through the aftermath as if through a hospital corridor where stitches had been sewn with a steady hand. Mee's ledger walked the floors like an improved crease in the building's skin. She tucked stamps into pockets and straightened the tie of a clerk who had been shaking. At one desk, an archivist replaced a mislabeled box with a proper label and allowed himself a small, disbelieving grin. At another, Registrar Amy filed the last of my emergency requisitions and then, for a second, leaned on the counter and let the pause between breaths be a conversation. The romance that had seemed precarious under the strain of shifting weeks reassembled itself in that pause. We had risked a week and kept another person's memory. That felt like a bargain every bit as serious as any legal exemption. Owen, who had been gracelessly heroic in the best way, made his decision before most of us realized he had. For days had been holding the old file, an embarrassment of a thing with a ribbon of dried glue and the faint perfume of an afternoon that refused to be filed away. He had told us in that easy, skirting way he uses when avoiding the important things, that he kept it because it made him laugh. That was not, in the world of the borough, a defensible policy. "I am not against rules," he said when he finally sat down beside me and smoothed the file with both hands, as though it were a living thing. "I am for the people who need them slightly bent." Then he took a stapler and, with an absurd solemnity that made my throat ache, he stapled that old file closed and opened a new one marked preservation. One file. One life. It felt like a vow. He repaired it properly. There was a scene in the basement during which grit and dust turned gold in the light from Harmon's lamp. I watched him thread staples through soft, fragile paper with the kind of care reserved for broken toys and family recipes. Around us, boxes of amendments hummed gently like machines dreaming of punctuation. After he finished, he rose and, very quietly, said, "It's fixed enough." The phrase was not about paper, we all understood. Mr. Pockets returned the umbrella that had been used as bait, striped with a child's drawing of a dragon, like someone surrendering an old kindness back to the world. He padded through the main floor with Pockets jingling, depositing single gloves and an errant key into the lost and found, as if replenishing the moral stores of the building. Mabel, who had fed us a stew that tasted like a weather forecast, gave me a ladleful to go and said, blunt as a ladle, "Eat. You look like someone who needs to be put back together." I ate at my desk because that is how one keeps working in offices that resettle the course of days, in modest bites between stamped corrections. The stew, true to form, offered a small vision as I ate a memory of my mother titling boxes in a neat, economical hand. It was a warm, chastening thing to remember as the morning's weirdness seeped into every crack of my certainty. The automation faction, predictably, did not disappear. They regrouped in a conference room with a flip chart and bullet points. Their argument was not stupid. Machines could be precise, untiring, and impartial. They would not be tempted by nostalgia or mercy. They would, the proponents claimed, eliminate the very possibility of an error like the one I had made. I would have felt one way about this before the slip, before lobster hats and soup profits. I would have felt the rigid comfort of a perfectly scheduled world. But the slip had shown me something else, that errors sometimes detour into acts of kindness. Machines do not do detours. They do not conveniently sing. We postponed the automation vote. No dramatic filibuster or passionate monograph. Mims. Ledger, who handles signatures like punctuation, slid a postage stamp across the board and wrote in the margin, in a hand that trembled only once, "Decision deferred. Human judgment required. I do not know how to translate Ms. Ledger's handwriting into law, but her hand carried authority of a particular kind. It was a hand that had once defied a regulation to save a weather festival, and that had always known that rules are, sometimes, shelter, sometimes a cage. Dot claimed a place in the decision. The little sprite, paper-thin and coffee-stained, had been essential bait in the rituals that day, and had eaten several particularly troublesome marginalia with a smile that looked like an ellipsis. When we began to catalogue what we would keep, Dot circled the maybe folder with a tiny sound that could have been a chuckle and left a flourish of marginalia. We are margins, and we will now be a margin that gets a desk. No one in the office could exactly explain how a sprite negotiates bureaucratic recognition, but we put Dot on the supply list anyway. Registrar Amy filled out the paperwork. Sprite allocation form 1.1 Vanson 3 desk space 06 cup of coffee allowance. The printer coughed dutifully. Dot chewed on the corner of a comma and looked pleased. The mayor's lobster, a thing that would have been ridiculous on any other day, was escorted back through the bureau for a ceremonial notarization. Someone had knitted a tiny civic sash for it. The lobster sat solemnly on the mayor's shoulder as Harmon signed a permit with a fountain pen that burped out a small cloud of ink like a ceremonious cough. The mayor apologized, awkward and sincere, to a crustacean he now recognized as a partner in public relations. The lobster, for its part, clicked its claws once in what the mayor later described as approval. The city announced, with a carefully measured press release, that it would henceforth be open to charming anomalies, provided they carried appropriate identification. The romance subplot, if you can call it that, when every heartbeat is potentially an administrative oversight, found its small, ordinary conclusion that afternoon. Amy and I stepped into a supply closet for privacy, and, because secrets in government buildings are best kept behind reams of paper, kissed while the copier warmed itself to life. When we pulled apart, Amy smudged a little toner on her thumb and held it up like a small medal. "You fixed this," she said, not unkindly. "And you didn't try to fix me into something I wasn't." My cheeks heated like a misfiled afternoon. There was more paperwork than I had imagined possible. Forms dressed in their best fonts marched down the corridors. Requisition 77B was filed under aftercare, Amendment 12C under emotional remediation. And an old ledger that had been known to swallow interns now sat placid and well-fed in a new annex. We had to account for public confidence. We had to file incident reports about the lobster hat and the rain and the retired postman's second childhood. We had to complete surveys for the city council that asked whether citizens felt stable, improved, or delightfully unsettled. Delightfully unsettled is not normally an official category, but after a spirited debate and several postage stamp negotiations, it made it onto the form with an italicized asterisk and a smiley face that means. Ledger insisted be removed before submission. I kept busy with the small, honest business of undoing my own error and learning to live with the consequences. Some corrections were simple: a stamp here, a signature there, an apology to a stapler underlined and placed in the maybe folder. Others required that peculiar thing the Bureau excels at: improvisation within procedure. We wrote memos that read like poetry and policies that allowed for mercy. Harmon wrote a directive that read, in part, "Human judgment will be preserved as a core function of this office. Machinery may assist but will not adjudicate exceptions without oversight." It sounds sensible when I say it now. In the moment, it felt like flinging a blanket over the shoulders of a frightened city. By mid-afternoon, the floors took on their old rituals with a new, gentler cadence. The lunchroom had become a sort of temple of small reconciliations. People quietly admitted fears, confessed silly superstitions, and accepted help in the form of ladles. Ms. Ledger, who counts paperclips when she is stressed, left a small pile of newly counted paperclips on my desk with a note, "For when you feel unordered." I put one in my pocket. Late in the day, as the building wound down into a more manageable hum, I found myself alone in front of a cabinet of completed forms. On the top shelf sat a manila folder with my handwriting on the tab. It read simply "Maybe." I had made it during a blinding, anxious hour and meant it as a receptacle for the apologies I was not yet ready to file. Now it felt like a liturgy. I opened it and began to transfer the small, chosen delights onto neat index cards. Mayor's lobster permitted. Rain for sad umbrellas permitted. Tuesday replay for retired postman permitted. For each item I wrote a short justification that was part policy and part love note. The cards smelled faintly of toner and Mabel's soup. There is a dangerous virtue in lists. They make uncertainty look like order. We had not banished the slip. It lingered in the margins, subtle and grinning. It left crumbs, tiny bits of erased ink that I always found on the soles of my shoes, and sometimes the clocks in the stairwell would chatter at odd intervals. But it had been negotiated with. We had placed boundaries around mischief and tied them with stamped ribbon. It would return, because that is what margins do. That is also what life does. Before I left, Harmon called us into the hall and said something that has lodged in me like a well-loved sticky note. "We guard continuity," he said, "but continuity without surprise is not life. We repair the world, but we also keep aside a drawer for the things that make breathing worth the trouble." He tapped the humming key and it thrummed in reply, like a small, obliging engine. We filed the last emergency stamp at dusk. The building's lights went to a softer setting, and the smell of toner cooled into the metallic chill of evening. People bowed to one another with the wary reverence of those who have stitched a wound and found not only healing but a scar worth remembering. Mies. Ledger tucked a charm into the maybe folder herself. I watched her fingers move, sure and small. Order, occasionally porous, she said. Good enough. It was, for her, a concession and a blessing. I left later than everyone else, as is my way, carrying the maybe folder beneath my arm like contraband. Outside, the city had resumed its ordinary cadence. The mayor's lobster had a small sash that gleamed in the lamplight as they paraded past a cafe window. A woman with a polka dot umbrella let the rain fall only on her cheeks and laughed. In the park, an old postman sat for a long while on a bench reading a paperback and occasionally grinning in a way that suggested the world had done him a quiet kindness. I walked home through streets that seemed to have been carefully rearranged by an invisible clerk, lamplights aligned, bus schedules slightly more punctual in a way that felt generous rather than tyrannical. For the first time since my misfile, I felt like the kind of person who could carry a folder of maybe things and not drop them. I felt lighter and more culpable, which is to say more alive. When I reached my apartment, I sat at my small kitchen table and made a list of my own petty delights I wanted to protect. I wrote them on index cards and placed them in a drawer labeled perhaps. It felt foolish and sacred. I slept that night with the taste of Mabel's stew in my mouth and a tiny ink smudge on my thumb. It felt like a promise. Somewhere in the margins of the bureau, a smudge sighed and was contented. The slip had retreated but had left a single, perfectly placed crumb of erased ink on my desk, as if to remind me that there would always be room for error. I don't think we cured anything so much as reached an agreement. The next morning I returned to a desk that smelled predictably of toner and distant thunder. My blazer fit the same awkward way. The ledger of the world was not a perfect object. It was a thing we negotiated with. I placed 2 new index cards into the maybe folder as if tucking in small, vulnerable flags, one for the lobster, one for the rain. I slid the folder into the shelf between forms labeled errata and emergency humor. When someone passed by and asked me how I felt, I shrugged and hummed a bureaucratic jingle I had never before known existed, and which I now sang with slight modifications. It went something like this: stamp, seal, keep what heals, and let the margins speak. It is a long chorus, it will be sung again. And when I reached for my pencil to make the next entry another small delight, to hold against a hungry world a faint smear of ink on the edge of the paper wiggled like a tiny smile. I pinned it with a thumbnail and wrote, for the record, to be reviewed in 6 months. The hook, if you will, is that somewhere beneath the neat shelf labeled maybe, in the seam of a box stamped with dates that do not exist, a single piece of paper coughed. It was very small, easily overlooked, and smelled faintly of coffee. It read in handwriting not unlike mine, and not entirely unlike the slips, "Do not close the drawer entirely. There will be more to file." I closed the shelf gently, which is what one does with promises, and went to make tea.